All right, media studies. We are on to chapter 42, and we are talking today about consumer cultures. So, probably going to add some more key terms here by the time you guys get to this particular section of the notes. But I'm going to leave it be for right now because I just want to go ahead and do your video first. You've got your discussion questions, 3 of them specifically about what we've read in the text, and then the 2 questions for your project. So, for your project today, when we go through the notes, you'll see here in a minute, I'm going to talk to you about the introduction of consumable goods, and your media texts are considered consumable goods. How they get introduced into our society. We're going to talk a little bit about, for you guys, because of the modern ideas we're talking about, I'm going to ask you to think about advertising measures that informed your audience of your media text, that told your audience, hey, there's a new consumable good out there. And then the second one is we're going to go a little bit deeper. You should kind of already have this question answered, but just to reiterate it, make sure you've got it answered completely and thoroughly. Looking at your audience of your media text, and does that audience, as far as like demographics go, is there a controlling group? Is there what can you tell me about your target audience group? And was that the intended audience, or is that kind of just a passive resulting audience? So your notes. We're talking about consumer cultures. And consumer cultures, when we say the word consumer culture, the idea is that the culture is consumerism. The culture is being a consumer. So culture in the aspect that everyone buys things. Everybody falls into the economic system somewhere, and they purchase stuff, whether it be out of need, whether it be out of want, or whatever the case may be. Um, at some point, the idea is that we as a society place an emphasis on purchasing goods and services. It's kind of one of those defining criteria and factors for the world, social class, if you will. Um, and historically, you read in the chapter throughout history, there have been times where purchasing goods and service was the centralized practice. It was what set up social rules. It set up and defined how people interacted with one another. A lot of this was like 17th, 18th, and 19th century, um, depending on when certain items became popular in the market, and we turned them into a trade system. Um, and so throughout history, we saw different periods of time where different things were the hot commodity of what you could buy and why you were buying it, what use of it was, like what use did it have for you, or what purpose did it serve. Um, and so again, as a historical approach, we get to more modern times, and we continue looking at this idea of consumer culture and consumerism. Um, and we've got a better understanding. We've got a more refined understanding of it. So consumerism and economic advancements, we're talking here about what we can sell, why we sell it, and how we sell it. For example, the introduction of sugar, tobacco, and chocolate to the market. When these things came out as being consumable goods and people realized, hey, we can use these things and we can use these things for a lot of different purposes, supply and demand kicked in, and it was like, whoa, I gotta have it, we gotta buy it. And so you saw this economic surge, um because we had this new item on the market and people wanted to buy it because it was a valuable commodity. However, that wasn't always the case, and it wasn't always that simple, because historically we know some things to be true. And this was the sad reality of the world that we lived in then, and we maybe possibly still live in now. Um, when items go to market and we can buy them, there are certain set of like social rules that usually tend to fall into place about who buys it, why and when, there's the crowd that's going to buy the newest sneaker that comes out, because that's part of their culture, that's part of their consumerism. And then you've got another group that may not be as privileged to buy the newest pair of sneakers as soon as they hit the market. They may wait until they're a season or two old. They may wait until something better comes along, or they may not buy them at all. And so some of these criteria that dictated these social rules were gender, obviously, location, social status, religion, heritage. These things today still largely influence consumerism and things that we purchase. Think location. Um, if you live in a very rural type place and you've got a lot of land and you can possibly farm or grow your own produce, location wise, I'm not going to need to buy as many like produce goods from the grocery store because I can grow them in my own backyard. Um, Maybe religion impacts me from buying something. Maybe my religion believes in not piercing your body. Okay, well, now all piercings and all stores that sell any kind of adorning jewelry like that would have to puncture the skin, they're no longer of use to me. um, Maybe my heritage, and I believe in my heritage very strongly, and therefore I don't need this particular item because it's not something common in my heritage. Okay, so as far as consumerism and purchasing, despite a product being new, that does not always guarantee it will sell. You still have these criteria that you have to account for. Um, in targeting your audience, you need to make sure that you understand these rules that are going to govern who's going to purchase your consumable good and why. Um, and so, when these goods and services are made available and the producers have considered the social rules of purchasing, um, they put their product out and we see consumerism come out. We see people purchasing them. And this impact of consumerism then influences identity formation. So the newest pair of shoes that comes out, um, we see a certain identity associated with people who buy those. The newest iPhone that comes out, we see an identity with those people that comes out because this is the good or service that they chose to purchase. It's part of who they are. And so, consumer culture, not just about the consumer, but it also obviously depends on production because a lot of what we're talking about today with this consumer culture has to do with a new good or service coming to the market. Well, where does that good or service come from? The producers and production. Um, but when you think of production and we talk about consumer culture, I don't want you to just think of the idea of creating, but think of it as a symbol of expansion in society. Um, you may want to call it growth, but you have to be careful because historically, while production meant maybe something got larger or had a greater expanse, it wasn't always a good thing. Um, and so, production as a symbol in society, and the fact that when we produce, we create consumption, and that consumption historically also had a relationship with a certain level of power and a certain level of influence. Um, and we see this because between production and consumption, we also have to consider the economics of the situation. So when sugar, tobacco, and chocolate were introduced into the market and the economic standing of the world soared. It excelled because we had this new product that people wanted, people paid money for it. We saw a surge in economics. We saw a very high level of economics. Well, that also meant that whoever had the biggest production and consumption of those three goods had the most power because they had the most money at the time. So, historically, with consumer culture, you see a lot of power also being influenced. Um, and that kind of ties everything back together for us. Uh, So I want to go back to your questions really quickly. Because power is kind of where your chapter leaves off at, and I think we'll get back into it later. So that's probably why they stopped there. But I want to reiterate and revisit for your project what I need you to do. Um, let's go back to your slide. that actually talks about your project here. So students should have identified a media text by Friday, April 24th. Media texts are anything, guys, from TV shows to books, movies, albums, news broadcasts, news articles, blogs, vlogs, video games, whatever the case may be. And what you're doing, the whole point of this project is to analyze the audience of that media text. So I'm not so much concerned about the actual media text. I'm concerned about the audience of the media text. And what you guys are going to do is throughout the unit, you're going to answer these discussion questions and you're going to make yourself some notes about how that particular chapter relates to your project and how that particular chapter helped you understand the audience of your media text. And at the end of all this, you're going to film a podcast for me. Your podcast, I do expect a certain level of like high quality video. I completely understand you guys are at home, a plain wall background or whatever the case may be, wherever you need to sit at your kitchen table and the china cabinets behind you so I can see the dishes, it's fine. What I'm more concerned with is that when you film your video, you are able to explain yourself, you are able to explain your project and your audience and how you understood all of this about your audience, that you've answered all of the discussion questions from the chapters and how they relate to your projects. And that's it. This doesn't have a time to it. I didn't put a time on it. I didn't want to put that kind of pressure. Just be thorough, make sure you answer all the questions. So go back to chapter 42. And again, today, you're thinking about how was your media text introduced as a consumable good, what advertising took place, or how did people know about your media text? How did it come out into the world? And then the next question is the pattern of audience for your media text. So going back to your question from chapter 40 here about the demographics of your audience, now you're going to tell me if there's a pattern in that audience. You know, gender wise, location wise, social status, religion, and heritage. Do you see that most or all of your audience belongs to a particular gender group, a particular location, a particular social status? Okay. Make sure you hit all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those categories. Okay. And that's it for chapter 42. We'll do 43 next.